Hello.
Oh, hello, hello. Managed to stop myself from singing yet again. See, I'm great at this. I'm great at
How's
not
it going?
humming on air.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
I've
Back for
actually, like,
another episode?
for once, I haven't seen you since I think like last live stream, which kind of never is very rare. So good to see.
Yeah, well, you've been jet setting.
Yes. So I'm very jet lagged. I love how I appear in this live stream. Sometimes, like, last time I haven't spoken to anyone all day, right? So I was unable to put sentences together, and today I'm just really jet lagged. And I'm also unable to put sentences together. So professional. But anyway,
We
we'll
make it work.
survive. We make it work. So, hello everyone, and welcome to the episode 4 of season 10 of Disasters Deconstructed.
Yeah, we're really happy that you're joining us again to think through some these big concepts and ways of approaching disaster that we have outlined in the upcoming book. As you know, we have some of the authors joining us in every episode in season 10. So we had already 3 great discussions that you can catch on YouTube, where they're stored. Intro to the whole series, and then we talked about feminism and we talked about urbanism, and today we're talking about anarchism. So we have more lined up through the rest of the year, as well as some reading together, hopefully this summer. And so, yeah, just happy that whoever is out there listening is kind of along for the journey. And hopefully by the end of the year, we also have the book published, and you can see all of the contributions. But today we're going to talk about a few more of those contributions.
Yes. And so joining us today, Ruth Kinna and Alex Christoyannopoulos. And both Ruth and Alex are my colleagues at Loughborough. So yay. My favorite colleagues at Loughborough, of course. Just a couple of months ago, I honestly, Ruth, that still remains to my best coffee catch up ever. It was the most fantastic 50 minutes of my intellectual life. So thank you for that. And Alex, of course, some of you know already because Alex has joined us 2 seasons ago. I've lost track. Something like that. So, the fame. So, quick introductions. Ruth is a professor of political theory and historian of ideas, specializing in 19th and early 20th century socialist thought, especially in anarchism, utopianism, and activism. And Ruth's current research and her forthcoming book, which is coming very soon, I hope, develops an account of anarchist constitutional politics. And Alex is a reader in politics and international relations, and his research focuses on pacifism and especially on anarcho-pacifism, and of course on Leo Tolstoy's political thought and Christian and religious anarchism. And we will be talking about all of this today. So thank you both for joining us and welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for the invite.
Yay.
Yeah, so happy that we get to spend some time with you both today. And in our previous episodes and throughout the whole season, we want to ask some of the authors in the collection that is going to be published about their inspirations for their thinking, for their scholarship. And so we're starting with the same question for all of our guests. What do you read? And how did you start reading the stuff that you're reading? And what inspires you and your work? So maybe we can start with Ruth and then Alex.
Okay, so that's just a huge question, right? How did I start reading about anarchism? I started off as someone who didn't know anything about anarchism and had come across it, I suppose, as a sort of a movement and a politics that had been eclipsed on the left. So this was back in the 80s, and when, as far as I was concerned, politics was being increasingly defined by Thatcherism and the right. And although I sort of thought of myself as someone who was on the left, I was not particularly happy in any of the sort of the Marxist sort of groups that I came across. They all seemed a bit muscular to me. And when I came across anarchism, I seemed to find a home. And I started reading it as I suppose, as a historian, someone who was sort of trying to catch up with a movement from the 19th century, and then increasingly became interested in the kind of the 20th and 21st century politics or contemporary political theory of anarchism. And that's how my career has kind of gone. So I've moved from increasingly, from into politics from history. And as I've done that, I suppose I've been driven by the desire to think about how anarchism speaks to areas of politics from which it's being neglected or passed over or ignored because of the way in which it still tends to get portrayed as a rather kind of niche or destructive kind of set of ideas. And my recent work as you mentioned, I mean, I've been thinking about how anarchism speaks to constitutional politics. I've been thinking about how anarchism speaks to prison abolition, to sort of more contemporary kinds of problems, and that's kind of how I read.
Thanks, Ruth. How about you, Alex?
I mean, I think my route to anarchism was really Tolstoy, and Tolstoy just post 9/11, fresh after 9/11. I genuinely can't remember when I stumbled upon Tolstoy and The Kingdom of God is Within You. And so, of course, this is the Tolstoy after his conversion, where he settles on this kind of radical pacifist view that takes him onto sort of an anarchist critique of the state. And so for a while, my work was on Tolstoy, then Christian anarchism, then Tolstoy, and kind of back and forth between those two, and religious anarchism more generally. But for the last few years, I'm more interested more broadly in, I suppose, anarcho-pacifism and kind of pacifism on steroids, if you want, but also not necessarily just the kind of, I don't know, absolutist, deontological pacifism, to use a long word, that would be Tolstoy's often, just out of principle, but also because of practical reasons, because of its consequences. And so I suppose if I do try and find a sort of a golden thread through my research interest over the last 20 years or so, it would be around violence and the critique of violence, the critique of the readiness to sort of resort to violence, despite the mounting evidence of all the harm that it does, and this not just violence kind of direct, but also violence that we do to one another through the state, violence, structural violence, as in and all of that. And I mean, you can probably enrich that, but it probably comes down to kind of that, and therefore it's not surprising that Tolstoy, I suppose, was the kind of way in. But and through Tolstoy, I've become interested in much else that anarchism has to offer too, and I suppose radical pacifism too.
Super. I kind of love that. I don't know how many people, about 10 people we've spoken about so far, right, on this last few episodes. And nobody's path is quite kind of straightforward, right? People start like reading something and then end up somewhere absolutely where probably nobody expected any of us to end up. And I love this. And to me, this is kind of this whole point of this conversation, maybe to encourage people to just read, and you just never quite know where you'll end up. But Ruth, let's talk about your entry. So you wrote about Kropotkin, and I think when I invited you, I kind of mentioned that Kropotkin every now and then sort of pops up in disaster talks, right? Very particular scholars, generally when we talk about mutual aid, but nobody really kind of, I don't think, thinks with him or things through him when we talk about disasters, and so your entry was really kind of a breath of fresh air in that sense. So tell us, why Kropotkin? Why should we think about his work when we talk about disasters?
Right. So Kropotkin was my sort of gateway, if you like, the equivalent of Alex and Tolstoy. So Kropotkin was, he's regarded as the sort of, he's still regarded as one of the major anarchist thinkers of the 19th century. So I spent a lot of time with Kropotkin. I did my thesis on Kropotkin. I still read Kropotkin and I still get more out of him. But as you say, Kropotkin is an obvious choice, I think, for disaster studies, because he develops this theory of mutual aid in the late 1880s, and he continues to talk about it for the rest of his life, really. And mutual aid is it's a mainstay of anarchist thought, but I suppose it's become increasingly sort of part of a popular discourse because of disasters. So one of the things that people notice in disasters, floods, fires, you name it, we've got many of them to deal with. What tends to happen immediately is that state response is quite slow. Sometimes it doesn't come at all. Sometimes it's deliberately held back. So what do people do? They rely on each other. And that's mutual aid. And the other thing that you tend to notice in disasters is also that where those networks already exist, so particularly amongst marginalized communities who tend to be excluded from state resource in the first place, that response tends to be much more effective, much quicker, and much more enduring. And Kropotkin is interesting because he kind of gives us a reason to understand this, why it is that groups that are more remote from states tend to be more able to rely on each other for help when they need to, and why that's therefore a sort of a positive way of thinking about how we might organize our own practices and systems and institutions in order to promote mutual aid, rather than to promote, as he sees it, welfare, which comes at costs, one of which, as Alex has already mentioned, is institutionalized violence. So, I mean, what Kropotkin gives us is a sort of an alternative way of thinking about human relationships. And the bottom line, I suppose, of Kropotkin's thought is that we should not buy into a narrative that says we're all suspect to each other, we're all potential threats to each other. What we should be thinking is that we're interrelated, we are interdependent, and we should tap those relationships in order to enhance and develop our well-being. And that's what mutual aid is, and that's why I think it's a really positive response to disaster, because it helps us think about the disaster not just in terms of the headline event, but in terms of some of those forces and power arrangements which help explain why disasters play out in the way that they do.
Yeah, quite inconvenient for many, right? This is exactly the narrative that is kind of it has been and is being hidden when we talk about disasters. But it's interesting to see that sort of positive twist. If we Jason and I have been talking about it in relation to vulnerability as well, how vulnerability isn't necessarily just a bad thing. And I use them quotation marks, but how do we think about it more when it comes to solidarity as well? So certainly really useful framing. But one thing that kind of blew my mind, when we were talking about Kropotkin, is of course the kind of the prediction, and not quite the right word, I use in quotation marks, of the kind of impacts and devastations in climate change that he was writing about in sort of early 1910s. I think when I came out of the meeting with you, I immediately texted Jason. I was like, "Oh my God, did you know?" It was like the highlight of my day. So can you tell us a little bit more on sort of Kropotkin and climate change? Because I don't think anybody knows anything.
Yeah, so Kropotkin's basic thesis is that he's interested in how people or how species adapt to their environments. So he elaborates the theory of mutual aid actually as a critique of social Darwinism, and basically the argument is that nature is not red in tooth and claw. Right? Nature is actually cooperative. It's a cooperative space. Of course, there is a tendency also to conflict. But actually, if you leave people to organize under their own steam, by their own processes, what you'll find is that they'll also come up with systems of conflict resolution. They don't actually need a third party to keep them from killing each other. But because he's interested in the way that species adapt to their environments, he's also interested in the best ways in which you can facilitate effective adaptations. And you do that by thinking about potential threats to your well-being. And you do that by sharing knowledge in order to build scientific knowledge about how you can mitigate those threats. And so the argument is that we have to cooperate with each other in order to share best knowledge about our environments, in order then to provide resource and help in moments of foreseeable crisis or disaster. And one of the things that he becomes aware of in the, as you say, it's around 1906, is this data which says the Earth is heating up. So at this point, Kropotkin doesn't think that this is a reflection of man-made interventions or of industrialization. He thinks that this is a natural process. He's been working on, he's a geographer, he's been working on theories of glaciation for most of his life. But he is very concerned that if the world is heating up, then that has potentially dramatic impacts on our food production. And if that has dramatic impacts on our food production, or where we can produce, how we can produce, then that's also going to have impacts on migrations, not just of humans, but of all living things. So as a geographer, he's interested in thinking about how a certain phenomena or event can have ramifications on the sort of the patterns and flows of life. And climate change is one of those. So what he's trying to think about is how we should alter our processes of production to ensure that people don't starve, where they've been used to producing in one particular way that's going to become redundant over a period of maybe 50, 100, 150 years, whatever it is. And we can do that if we share. What we're not going to do, if we adapt through state mechanisms, then what you're going to find is that the exercise of power is going to determine who the winners and losers are in these events. And that will exacerbate the disasters. It will turn something that is natural and potentially controllable by all of us through our cooperation into something that we become rivals in dealing with. And that just adds to the level of disaster and hardship.
Wow, we've nearly been talking about it for 120 years.
Yeah.
And kind of getting worse, I think.
Yeah. So he's thinking about, how deserts are extending and this sort of thing, and how that affects people's livelihoods.
Yeah, it's incredible. And I don't really know why we don't talk about it more, kind of why we've never connected to Kropotkin, but now we've had, so this is exciting.
If I may, Ruth, I just had a thought about like how different societies embrace this kind of thought surrounding mutual aid, and also governance systems, and whether you see differences globally in terms of societies that are able to fully express like what Kropotkin saw as like our kind of natural orientation towards each other, and places where that's kind of prohibited, and why.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So, generally speaking, he's very concerned with the way in which Europe is sort of extending itself across the globe through colonialism and imperialism, and the way in which that process is wiping out indigenous cultures. Not only, so he thinks that the state is a colonizing process. So when we think about colonialism, he's not just thinking about the ways in which European power is projected outside the borders of Europe. He's also thinking about the processes of homogenization within these territories, to think about how, for example, Welsh people are being subjected to norms which are not their own. So people having to adopt the same religions, the same languages, the same systems of education, all the rest of it. And so Kropotkin's idea is that, if you can try and arrest these processes by extending the field of mutual aid, then what you're also doing is extending the diversity of views that exist across peoples. So people will understand their environments in particular ways, and they'll have local know-how, if you like, about how best to adapt to this particular environment. And what he wants to see is a world in which people share that know-how in order to build what we might call a science, rather than for some people in some parts of the world to be able to invest in certain kinds of practice and then demand that everybody else follow their view of that world, their science. He thinks that actually all of our knowledge should be based and enriched by a diversity that we find in the landscape, in the globe itself. So, these things, that's part of life. Life is diversity, and trying to homogenize it, trying to control it, is itself a way of making us not only less rich, but also less able to adapt, because the world is diverse. It's not the same. That's the point.
Absolutely. So, Alex, I want to talk to you about Tolstoy. And so I was looking through our archives and I found it's season 8, episode 2, if anybody
Okay.
wants to go deeper into the conversation on Tolstoy with Alex, which was a great episode. And so I want to hear from you what you think that disaster scholars and people who want to understand disasters more fully can learn from Tolstoy's thinking.
Thanks for the kind words, by the way. So, full disclosure, I'm not a disaster scholar myself, so I can't necessarily locate precisely exactly how he best contributes. But Tolstoy's main contribution is again around violence. For him, violence is wrong. It's wrong because it causes harm. It's a form of enslavement. It's hard to judge that the violence. I mean, you inflict violence, you think it's right. The other side's rarely going to see it. So there's always going to be disagreement about when violence is kind of correct or not. Violence also has an effect on the perpetrator. It kind of transforms them into kind of, I suppose, don't want to say worse human beings, but yeah, it transforms them in the process and kind of dehumanizes them as well in a sense. It aggrieves the perpetrators who will seek revenge. And so violence is always wrong. It scars, it breeds anger. And for him, that then extrapolates to the state. And the state he has in mind, in particular, the sort of Tsarist state of his time, but you can apply it to all states where, there's a sense of distant hierarchy that's entrusted with political decisions. For him, the idea of a state, so precisely against the kind of stuff that Kropotkin would favor, entrusting someone far away or a group of people to take decisions rather than doing it locally and bottom up is, if I may, a disaster. It's kind of responsible for much violence, direct and indirect. The state inflicts violence directly, police, armies, wars, whatever, and indirectly because of the way it redistributes, typically from the poor to the rich. There's a bit of a break after the Second World War where things were a bit different for a while, but we seem to be going back to a different scenario now. And so his main contribution is to zoom on that and to offer a range of, I guess, arguments for why violence is problematic and for why the state is problematic because it is violent, therefore. And then from then on, I guess his main argument is to say, if we don't want that, we just have to stop contribute to it. And that means, of course, don't sort of enlist in the army, but maybe don't take part in jury service, don't maintain the kind of structures or even the narratives that justify the continuing existence of these structures that kind of take decisions for us, are ostensibly democratic. You get a little say every 4 years, but that's about it. And even then, you can debate how much that reflects the actual will of what people would want on the ground, etc. So that would be his main contribution. It's around violence and what it means. And I suppose last thing I'd say is he did write very well. And the thing is so Tolstoy is a weird candidate. He's a Christian anarcho-pacifist, I think is the more accurate label, but he's an awkward Christian. He doesn't believe in the resurrection. He doesn't like the church. He's an awkward anarchist. He doesn't get involved in the labor movement. He's not, embedded in those structures. He's not an activist really. He's wealthy as well, for that matter. And he's an awkward pacifist because he tends to be so absolutist in his pacifism. And yet, despite that, already at the time, and I think right up till now, you read him and he moves you. He kind of provokes you into rethinking the place of violence, your complicity in it. And even if you can't follow him fully, I suppose he shifts you a little bit. And that's probably welcome, given that precisely the fact that we kind of reproduce so much violence by consent, as it seems, or implicitly, because that's so common. So the fact that he jolts you into rethinking this is, I suppose, his main contribution.
Yeah. So, and I think you start to kind of get to what I want to ask next, which is if somebody is like reading your contribution on Tolstoy, and they've arrived at this collection looking for kind of inspiration from different angles on how to understand disaster better or how to study disaster, Like, what do you think that they can take away from this about just considering violence and nonviolence in relation to disasters? What do you hope for a reader to be thinking of or reconsidering?
Yeah, I will say this. Tolstoy, I think, is good at doing what I just described. But in terms of what he leaves you with, what you do with that, he's not that helpful, because I mean, you know, some of it is, so stop contributing, don't devolve any kind of moral responsibility for the acts that are perpetrated by the things you consent to, given that you've consented to them if you haven't actually played an active part, etc. But it doesn't really give you much practical advice. And this is where I think some of the scholarship kind of further down the genealogy of, if you want, of pacifism and nonviolence, and specifically nonviolence, is more helpful. Because Tolstoy famously is one of the inspirations for Gandhi, who's a very different kind of figure on the pacifism and nonviolence, more nonviolent, strategic nonviolence side of things. And then there are many others, and I'm not claiming Tolstoy is kind of the origin of it, but he's one of the early figures. But since then, and since Gandhi in particular, a lot has been written, a lot has been done in terms of studying all this, that I think offers ways forward. So perhaps then for disaster planning, for example, about how it can be more non-violent. I mean, among other things, as I see it, what the research and the activism on non-violence suggests is kind of a kind of politics that's more in line with what Kropotkin would prefer, bottom up, more authentic, more engaged. Again, not necessarily expecting someone from afar to be trustable with decisions. It's a sense also of prefiguring and promoting a different way of life by the way you organize. So just take the matters in your own local hands, inclusively as a community, and build from there up, rather than expect, you know, Washington or some other kind of center to sort of help you. And so to that extent, it's kind of pushing towards thinking about non-violence in the fullest sense as a way of life as well, and as an attempt to, again, not be complicit in any form of violence. And the last thing I suppose I'll say is, okay, my take of this is if entire populations were trained into the techniques of non-violent civil disobedience, those populations would be more resilient, because it involves a lot of working together in the first place. But also it would encourage politicians to pay more attention to what they're doing, because if central government wasn't going to pay attention enough to what local populations want, then they'll face organized populations resisting, non-violently, but resisting stubbornly the kind of politics that they're promoting. And so for all these ways, I think that thinking along the non-violence route, kind of beyond Tolstoy, is where I would go when it comes to kind of what you do with it once you've been moved by Tolstoy to some extent, I suppose.
I think this is really interesting because, you know, like as Jason just said, we don't really think in terms of kind of violence, non-violence when we talk about disasters, but also we don't think, or not many of us think about kind of activism or disobedience when we talk about disasters either, right? It remains to be that really far removed, almost like an abstract idea, right, of sort of disaster risk and disaster risk reduction, disaster risk creation, that has almost nothing to do with civil society. And that's really quite problematic, right? Kind of when we start thinking about disasters as political event. And I think both Ruth's entry and your entry really kind of help us engage with this a little bit more. But yeah, it's I don't know. We've been, like Jason and I have been trying to kind of for years to push the colleagues in this direction, but it's tough, right?
I mean, if I may, just one of the things, I don't know if it's Tolstoy as such, but I read that in Tolstoy, and certainly he made me think along those lines. But it's the process whereby institutions, good intentions, ossify and transform over time, such that they betray the very reasons why they were set up. And I think that happens with a lot of local initiatives when they get scaled up or appropriated by the state. They end up doing the very opposite of what they were set up to do. And I think just an alertness to that is something that Tolstoy, along with numerous anarchists, would encourage. I'll shut up because others want to come in.
No, I was just to tag on to that. I mean, that, you know, one of the arguments that Kropotkin and other anarchists make is that, you know, one of the problems of authority is that it breeds passivity, and it disempowers people, because instead of getting used to making their own decisions in collaboration with others, they're waiting for somebody else to do something. So actually you become less effective, because you feel frightened about making a decision because you're so used to being told to do stuff. So, part of the idea is that mutual aid and bottom-up organising is a way of actually building resilience into a community, because it enables people to actually make decisions, make collective decisions. But the other thing I was going to say is that because the state authorities also, because of the way that welfare in particular is organised, that actually it's often initiatives are cut off at the root because they're told they don't meet certain requirements. So things are criminalised or made illegal or made outlawed when initiatives are taken because they don't fit the template. They haven't gone through the process. They haven't ticked all the boxes. And so you're disabling people from actually doing things. So one of the things that came up in the COVID-19 pandemic was that the scrubs that people were sewing for NHS workers weren't meeting the spec in one way or another. So it was better not to have scrubs at all because they weren't getting to the hospitals from the government than to have people make them locally. And that's that's a disaster.
Yeah.
It makes me think as well of community initiatives like sharing food or shelter, which are criminalized, not necessarily because they don't fit a spec, but more because it is a challenge to capitalism, I suppose.
Well, it's the same thing, isn't it? So meeting the spec is that you're not a provider, you're not a supplier.
Yeah. It's hard. I guess the justification for that is, we need to maintain quality with whatever.
Sure. So the way to do that is to enable the conversation between the hospital workers and the people who are making the kit, rather than leave the hospital workers without the kit.
Right.
Yeah.
What's also underlying all this is trusting people, trusting communities with their initiatives, trusting them with the ability to come up with, kind of standards to protect health workers, for example. But what you get with the way we tend to do politics, whether it's just the state or more than that and more complicated, is distrust of local communities, because suddenly they're supposed to sort of entrust others to take those decisions for them. And one of the things I like about anarchism is that it promotes values that trusting people in local communities to take the good initiatives by themselves, which they usually do.
Well, I think nothing comes without risk. But you learn by risk, and the costs of a risk at a local level are far less than the risks of something going wrong at a global level.
Yeah,
because your representatives have called it wrong.
Yeah, or called it in a way that kind of changes the whole narrative because the meaning wasn't there, right?
Yeah, or because of the interests that were active upon them.
Yeah, absolutely. This is fascinating. So let me ask you next question. Jason and I can often say that when we get, writings or kind of entries or just discussions with people who are not disaster scholars in that broader sense, right? We tend to get like the best insights because I guess as disaster scholars, we're quite blinkered in a particular way of thinking about disasters. So from where you're seated, in I don't know, anarchist studies, is there such a thing, in kind of your disciplinary historical political studies, what is your biggest hope for disaster scholarship and practice? Where do you see kind of this all should be unfolding? Ruth, I'll start with you.
So like Alex, I'm not a scholar of disaster studies, but I guess one of my I don't know if it's an ambition or a drive is to think about how anarchism speaks to other literatures, to other disciplines, to other problems. And so taking an anarchist perspective on disaster is a really sort of important thing to do, because otherwise what tends to happen is that I mean, certainly concepts like mutual aid, they're very easily appropriated. So mutual aid can become used by state agencies just in order to describe a process of efficient resource allocation. So mutual aid is used by police forces, for example, to enable one force to ship in officers from somewhere else in times of emergency. And so you lose that sense which mutual aid is supposed to be about solidarity, about giving without expectation of reward, about building interdependencies, about sort of really fruitful cooperation. And I think we live in a world which is messy and complicated, and anarchism often suggests to people that there's a kind of a zero-sum game here, that we're either anarchists or we're statists. And actually, people like Kropotkin and I think Tolstoy too see the world differently. They see the world about in terms of how you can increase the pressure towards different processes within the existing frameworks, within the existing power balances and setups. And so I think thinking intellectually about that is part of that process. So the way we think about the world is not separate from the way we act in the world. And so the more that we can bring anarchist perspectives to bear on all the problems that we face in the world, from any kind of discipline or within any kind of framework, if you can bring an anarchist perspective to it, then I think that's a good thing.
I love this. This is great. Alex, what's your hope for us?
I mean, I think firstly, with Tolstoy in particular, but actually on anarchists too, it's just an honesty about how our political processes or our way of doing politics is violent in the broadest sense of the word. So it's a diagnosing of that and being honest about it. There's also, I think, with Tolstoy and other anarchists, a suspicion of centralization, which I guess might be relevant to disaster scholars. Any entrusting of an increasingly centralized, potentially process should be treated with suspicion, because it tends to lead to, again, violence, distrust, disasters, perhaps in the long run, etc. But above all, again, not just Tolstoy, but with other anarchists, for me, it's about emphasizing the role of human agency, as in both in how things are, they don't have to be like this, they could be different, and how things can be changed, and how humans can do things differently. And resistance isn't easy, there's no guaranteed formula. And it's not just about resistance, it's just about the way the world is now is because that's how we have come to structure it. We are born into structures that we reproduce, but they don't have to be like that. There are other parts of the world that have produced different structures and they reproduce them differently. And it's so therefore it's an invitation to look at these different models and to see that it doesn't have to be like it is. Things could be different.
Yeah, I hope there would be, but both of you kind of mentioned, Ruth just now, and Alex, you mentioned this earlier, is the idea of appropriation. And this is something that, again, this is kind of, I know that some colleagues have been trying to unpack, so I'd like to follow up on this a little bit, since in the context of kind of hope. We sort of tend to see this happening over and over in disaster scholarship or in disaster praxis more than where, say, care is a great example, right? Where it became a really big thing, I think, during COVID, like all the literature all of a sudden bloomed on care, not just in disaster, but kind of geography and many other intellectual circles. And now we see the governments using care as a sort of benevolent, if you wish, but really quite kind of coercive way of presenting their own ideas, right? And the same previously happened with slogans like building back better, and then resilience before that, and kind of vulnerability falls into that. So how do you see kind of anarchism helping us fight this appropriation of ideas, of intellectual ideas, to kind of to maintain their kind of innocence, if you wish? It's not the best word, but their meaningful contribution, I guess, rather than innocence.
Should I go?
Yeah, go.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a particularly pressing problem because we've got we have a major movement in America which is now using a kind of a language of auto-globalization against social justice. Right? So, the idea of now being left behind is being weaponized in order to attack constitutional arrangements, and actually sort of liberal values and all the rest of it. And I think, it's, anarchists have long wrestled with disappointment. And I think there's a lesson in that, which is that, you have to get used to the setbacks. You have to get used to the disappointments. And that's not a reason to stop. You just have to remind people that, as Alex said, our arrangements are contingent. There are, within the constraints of what we inherit, there are different ways that we can organize. And actually, we can remind people that they do this all the time. And that's one of the things that Kropotkin wanted to point out. Mutual aid isn't something that you have to invent. Mutual aid is embedded in people's practices. And if you can use those exemplars, and if you can remind people that actually some of our best institutions are mutual aid institutions, and his favorite example was the Royal National Lifeboat Association. This is a voluntary organization which is designed just to save anybody who is in peril at sea. And it was politicized, of course, or it is politicized because of migration. But this is what people do, in their everyday practice. So this is not impossible. And I think that's not the only thing you can do, but it's one of the really important things that you can do. Just remind people that this is not pie in the sky. This is not about changing people's heads or forcing them to adopt an ideology. This is just finding spaces in which people can do what comes naturally actually to them. Cooperate.
There's so much you could say. I mean, I obviously agree with Ruth. I am tempted. I cannot not do that. I'm sorry. We've just published in the Journal of Pacifism and Nonviolence a paper on care that looks at precisely how neoliberal care is just one model, and it's deeply problematic, and it contrasts it with, I think, there's feminist, there's black, there's anti-abortion, sorry, what is it? There's abolitionist discourses, and there's anarchist ones. I think those are the four. So anyway, look that up if you're interested. I think, so look, politicians are adept politicians. It's not necessarily as individuals that it's a problem, it's structural. We have a system of representative democracy that means that politicians, those who make it and float around the top, are adept at sloganeering and picking up what seems to work. And if people are suddenly concerned about care, they'll use the language of care. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can trust them. Doesn't mean you necessarily have to distrust them. But what I would always say is follow the money. Look at who benefits. So when Nigel Farage portrays his party as the party of revolt, or Trump pretends to be an agent of change, look at who really benefits from the proposals and from what they actually do. And therefore think twice about that particular option, but also consider the structures that we have empowered and the kind of politics and political outcomes that they lead to. Don't place too much trust in someone who's promising some sort of solution, the kind of single savior, the particular, like Trump or Farage or any particular politician. Real change will have to involve kind of everyone getting involved to some extent, and the kind of change that's more likely to be trustworthy will be bottom up. It will involve communities coming together. It starts at the local, getting involved locally. And so that's not to say anyone further afield has to be distrusted necessarily, but look at who benefits from what's being proposed, follow the money, and look beyond the slogans.
This is great. I like that. We can maybe embrace it as a motto or manifesto. We're running out of time. We could. Oh, Jason, sorry.
I was just thinking when you're both talking about that you're really opening up some avenues to connect with disaster studies. And for me, I'm making a few notes because talking about like networks of care and solidarity is something that we do hear about. Thinking about risk as a place-based concept that's very localized, I think is something that we do talk about. And how we see community at that local level matters. So like when we think of like managing risk, right? You can take an approach to kind of try to like reduce vulnerability, say, which is very commonly used. But also on the flip side, building capacity, using an asset-based approach. That kind of approach is advocated for by many in our field. Rather than seeing community as weak and needy, you see community as strong and resourceful. And that's your starting point. And so I think that's kind of what it brought up for me in terms of a disaster studies lens, and how to connect with some of the really important thoughts that you all are sharing.
Can I just add? I mean, there's also sort of a management dimension to this. That if you want to, and I think that's also perhaps kind of a risk. If you want to empower communities and build bottom up and work by direct action and these sorts of agendas that anarchists promote, then I think you're also simplifying, because what you're doing is you're. I mean, the basic premise is that it is only us. In the end, it's only us. And it's therefore for us to manage our affairs. Well, if we're to manage our affairs, we have to simplify what we do. So, the radical change, if you like, in terms of thinking about how or the implications of for disaster studies of anarchism is that you are stripping things down. So the assessment of risk also has to change, because you're starting with a different set of premises. That actually, if you can't manage it yourselves, then perhaps you shouldn't be doing it.
And can I add I think so, because you talk about anarchism to different people that you encounter, and you kind of have to realize that the kinds of ideas that anarchists have promoted aren't exclusive to anarchists. I just want to put that point out. Like, you don't have to go with that particular word. There are plenty of interesting insights, especially so outside sort of post 19th century West, where these ideas tend to have conglomerated around the A word, the anarchism as a tradition, as of political thought, of activism, etc. In pre-colonial, post-colonial context, it might have a different name, and there's plenty of good ideas and good thinking there that's similar. It doesn't have to follow that. It's just that actually, if you dig into the anarchist tradition, there's tons of really interesting stuff and debate and disagreement, but it doesn't have to be with specifically only with that word, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. But this is fascinating. I'm kind of yet again, you two are leaving me with a lot to think about, and I thank you for that. It unfortunately doesn't happen too often. So thank you both so much for your time. I hope you'll come back and talk to us again. So for those of you watching us, thank you for joining us. It will appear as an audio episode at some point soon. Ruth, Alex, again, thank you so much for your time.
That's been fun. Thank you.
It's been great.
So everybody else will be back on Monday, 19th of May. We'll be chatting about Black scholarship on that day. And then we're going to decide what to read this summer, right?
Yes, then we have a reading break rather than a summer break. So if you have any suggestions, email us, post them on social media. Not entirely sure what social media we're using now, but you know where to find us.
Yeah. I don't know. We're on X for now, I guess, but
we'll figure that out.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks.
See you later. Bye.
Bye.